Hello and welcome to the February edition of the HBB TV webinar series. A very interesting topic which we see from the many registrations that we've received. More than 130 people are watching this live, at least they're registered for it. And of course, as usual, there'll be a YouTube recording for you to watch it at a later stage at your convenience. The great topic today, HBB TV in programmatic advertising and GDPR compliance. A very important, if not hot topic in the industry. And we have great experts for you talking to you about their experiences, their solutions, and their plans with these topics. We have Agustin Perez, who's CEO and founder of Cibo Ventures, a company you'll hear more about in a minute. Margarita Liadova, Director of Identity at Samba TV. If you're part of the industry, you've certainly heard about Samba TV. And of course, another company you're probably very familiar with, Leslie Shanklin, Vice President and Global Head of Privacy at Discovery. And she's also the co-chair of the HBB TV Privacy Task Force. As usual, please do submit your questions through the chat box of the GoToWebinar software that we're using. And in the last 15 minutes of this webinar, we have enough time to respond to your questions. Any queries you have, please direct them at the appropriate speaker, or if it's general, just pose a general question about HBB TV or solutions and services offered through the standard. Disclaimer first, and then we can get started. The presentation represents the views of the presenters and the companies he or she represents, not necessarily the views of the HBB TV Association. Let's get started with the first presentation, and let's welcome Agustin from Cibo Ventures.
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you. Let's see if the webcam is working. Then we can see you as well.
Can you see the?
We can see the presentation. Yeah. And now here you are. Hi.
Okay.
Welcome.
Perfect.
Good afternoon.
Okay. Thanks very much. Welcome to everyone. Thanks for attending this webinar. I had the hard tough task of introducing also the programmatic advertising a little bit. So maybe for some of you, we will explain some terms that you already know, but maybe for some others, this is something new. So I prepare a little introduction and first of all, to let you know about briefly about our company. So we are a Spanish firm founded in 2016, and we have currently different references in national and regional televisions, broadcasters in Spain. So we have two products, our CMP, concept management platform, and the other product that we run is consultancy on programmatic and monetization. So our platform is multi-platform, currently live in all these environments, HbbTV, Smart TV, in-app, and also web and mobile. It's certified by IB Europe. It's customizable for IB vendors, for non-IB vendors, and for purposes established by IB, and also custom purposes that can be customized for publishers. And it's only technology, so we don't have any other interest, so gathering data or things like that. It's not under our scope. We also work as consultants and in programmatic projects of all kind of platforms, and basically we try to be very updated in the latest technologies, and we are very trusted and experienced, especially in our current market in monetization and privacy. So that was a very brief introduction, so that's why. And now the first topic is to talk a little bit about what's programmatic advertising. So basically, in the digital environment, starting from the web, and later the apps, and now coming into the television, and the initial point was to directly deal between the publishers and the advertisers and agencies. But that changed, and there came into the action different kind of resellers and networks that were aggregating the inventory and reselling the inventory or audiences of that inventory to the same actors, advertisers and agencies. But the panorama, the scenario complicated a little bit more along the time. And then it came into action something rather more complex that we call programmatic advertising. And that basically allows to automatize the supply chain, like it has been done years ago in the, for example, in the car industry, where an electronic order was purchased through an automatic chain from the manufacturer, the car manufacturer, to all the suppliers. So here is exactly the same. So we put different technologies to sell the inventory and to buy the inventory and to trade it through the whole supply chain. I put these 3 screenshots, and here is a video for those that are not aware about programmatic advertising. This is a video from UK IB that explains very well how this has progressed. So basically, what's the programmatic TV is coming from the scenario of selling directly to advertisers and agencies, and doing it through different machines that are in the supply chains. Here's the definition of the IB Europe in a recent report. So an automatic approach to buying and delivering audience-based TV advertising through a software platform. It also says that it's not very developed, and that due to different things like regulations or class management or brand safety, etc. So things that we'll have to solve in the near future. So in this scenario where we have, and this is the scenario that I showed before, where there are different tech vendors or ad techs interconnected, and that and these tech vendors are purchasing the ad space in the different screens where we are selling, that we are seeing. And so in this scenario, it's necessary to manage the consent. So manage the consent of the user, because the television comes into a scenario where you can track the user. You can track which programs the user is watching, what time, and you can also track other devices in its home, like mobile associated to the same IP or to the same Wi-Fi, or tablets or other screens. So basically, in the television, we are coming from a world where you don't really have a control of who is watching, apart from making some surveys somehow, to a world where we can track every device. So it's clear that there is a need for privacy and a need for consent in this supply chain. And the question is that as there are many parts in these supply chains, many suppliers and vendors, then the publisher itself question who is allowed to receive this data, how can I share this consent to all these technologies? It's not an easy question, and that's why the consent management platforms were created. So they were created to comply with the GDPR and the e-privacy directive. When the personal data was processed, when a device was accessed or it was used to store information, And the consent management platform provides a way to transmit these consent signals through the whole supply chain, from the user that is here in the publisher page, window, video, etc., to the different vendors and to even to the advertiser. So CMPs, consent management platform, centralize and manage in a transparent way the consents and objections of the users and send them to the supply chain. The CMPs is a standard of the industry that has been put in place in the year 18, and that are live since then in desktop, in app, and in connected TV devices. Now we are evolving a little bit more, and we push also CMP to the hybrid broadcast to the HbbTV environment. So what a consent management platform standardized from IB is asking? It's asking the user about different purposes. So for example, can we store and access information on your device? Can we create personal ad profile? Can we select basic ads, develop and improve our products using the data that we gather? So those are questions. Also, other special features and features, like if we can link different devices like TV, mobile, tablet in your home, if we can geolocalize your device precisely, not in a cell, but in a very precise way. And the consent management platform is also asking the consent. It's asking for these things, but asking for a huge range of vendors that are subscribed to the transparency and consent framework. So, for example, this is a snapshot of some of the vendors behind that can be included as a standard in a consent management platform. So, Google, Spotex, Comcast, Freewheel, Magnite, SmartClips, Xandr, but there are many others. There are more than, I would say, almost 1,000 vendors that can be included. And then, as I told you, we already put live CMP in the HbbTV environment in Spain. So we did it in Mediaset in group in Spain. So Mediaset, according to the Kantar January data, it's the first Spanish broadcaster. It has we put live the CMP in these channels: Telecinco 4, Divinity, Energy, FTF, and BMAT. And the project objectives were, first of all, to standardize the consent across all the HbbTV ecosystem. So all the screens, all the channels have the same type of consent, and it was consent that was complying with IBIT Europe Transparency and Consent Framework. So it was important to be prepared for programmatic. It doesn't mean that it's going to happen right now, but because there are timings, but the good thing is that in the case that in the future you need to add many tech vendors in your supply chains, you are already prepared. And so it was possible to make available this consent for analytics, for advertising, for identification, or any other purpose that is included in this framework directly using our CMP. So about the implementation, of course, this was the very first time in HbbTV. So there are certain specificities that need to be solved. So there was some time of integration, not mainly because with each editor you need to see how they are launching HBBTV and how that integrates with the CMP. But it was not difficult, but it took some time. Also, there are many users involved, so you have to do your testing, etc. Of course, it was necessary to blacklist certain models. So we can see certain models of certain manufacturers that at the end do not support the CMP, and also that they are rather old to do it. And of course, there was a standard integration of all the IB vendors, and some figures when we launched the project early in January, we noticed a peak that we were expecting of consents, and then the consent management platform is working on the back end, but it doesn't show up unless the user wants to open it again or relaunch it. So it only shows one time, and then as all the users were having the consent, no new pop-ups were shown. And about the ratio of consents, it was in average 95% of acceptance. Okay, we can see here the example. So you can see how the HBBTV service was launched, and here is the banner that was conceived to launch the consent window. So 95% of the windows, sorry, 95% of the users follow this way. From the consent window, they just click accept and go to continue watching the television. There were around 5% of users that clicked to configure, and then they could go through different screens, selecting purposes or selecting partners. Okay. And then we could see this data across the dashboard, where you can measure, you can see how the consents are evolving, how many ad requests, how many times the CMP was shown, etc., and do some A/B testing if was necessary. And just to finalize, we had different onboarding methods. We used what we call the premium managed service. So we configured everything, and we have other configuration methods like the self-service plus, recommended for big publishers, where we also give the control of the configuration, or the self-service recommended for medium and small publishers with less knowledge or not tech or legal resources to do it. Okay, this is how we support also the customers with our Wiki or support ticketing. And here are some of the televisions and other media customers, as we have customers in all platforms that we have currently. Okay, and that is it. That is it. Thank you very much. And then I
you
can...
disappeared.
Sorry,
thank you, Augustine.
Sorry, I think I thought I have to stop the camera. Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah. So
yes,
thank
yes.
you very much for listening, and I'm open to questions later on at the end of the presentation.
That's what I wanted to say. Just briefly before we go to the next presenter, please do submit your questions for the panelists using the software and the chat box you can see, and we'll look into them at the end of this webinar in the last 10 to 15 minutes. So thank you again, Augustine, for this overview and the insights. Very interesting and a very good first introduction to the topic for maybe some of the people who aren't yet too familiar with it. They certainly are now. Let's go over now to Margarita from Samba TV, who's got some more insights for you from the Samba TV perspective. Hello, Margarita.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's really great to be here.
You're welcome.
Tell me, please, can you see my screen? It should be a
Yes,
presentation.
it's
Okay,
just
great.
perfect.
So I'm going to go ahead and get started.
Yes.
Okay, the screen's still there, right?
Yeah, it's still there.
Okay. Okay, amazing. Well, thanks again for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. My name is Margarita Lyadova, and I lead the global product strategy and development for identity at Samba TV. So a little bit about me before we get started. I began my career at Nielsen, where I supported all sorts of different products from the DMP to marketing mix modeling, and then to the infamous Facebook Nielsen relationship for the digital ad ratings product. I then went over to Adstra, and Adstra, by the way, is a small privately held company focusing entirely on identity resolution. And that's really where I got my expertise in identity, learning about what makes a good graph. I even spent some time in my career selling. I worked in sales before I went back to product. So ultimately, when the opportunity at Samba opened up to marry my experience in television with identity, I definitely jumped on it. Fun fact, I've only been in this job for 2 months, so I'm excited to share what I've learned in these 2 months with all of you, and I warmly welcome any questions at the end. I'm really excited to be here. So let's talk about what's on the agenda today. Let me know if you see the next slide. You should be able to see the next slide.
We see the agenda.
Fantastic. So let's get started. I'll start with a brief overview of Samba TV for those of you who are not familiar with our company. I'll then go on to discuss the opportunities within the connected TV landscape and specifically the use cases that connected TV has unlocked within our industry. And then I'll wrap up discussing how identity resolution works to facilitate the use cases. Now, my goal for everyone here is to walk away with a very clear message. The time to leverage connected television data is now, and it's incredibly useful for your overall business. I hope to convey that identity resolution is one of the best ways to do just that in our industry and in the landscape that we're in. So let's go ahead and start with the first item. First and foremost, what is Samba TV? Samba TV is a smart TV or connected TV data and insights company. Our mission is to create data at the heart of TV and power a more scientific approach to advertising. Our data powers TV innovation and consumer value for TV manufacturers all over the world, and it powers insights for the world's largest platforms, publishers, networks, and brands. These insights are available for both linear and streaming TV viewership. More tangibly speaking, what Samba owns is a proprietary automatic content recognition technology that sits embedded within televisions all over the world. Our global footprint is 46 million televisions, representing 24 unique smart TV manufacturers. This makes us the only independent TV ACR company in the world. In other words, most always when you see an ACR company, it's often owned by a single smart TV brand, whereas we capture 24 unique brands. This really allows us to get a diverse set of viewership because all of these brands have their own target market. Their TVs have different price points. So we're in a unique position to really leverage the data associated with different kinds of households, which is great. And when Samba was formed, our vision was very clear. For half a century now, media and advertising has far moved beyond the TV screen, and connected television and the data from connected television was the first time that we were able to marry the TV consumer with the digital consumer. There was finally a common denominator between the two universes. Now, the impacts of this are pretty important for our industry, and I'll give you a simple example that most of you are probably familiar with. Traditionally, television has always been a top-of-funnel, awareness-driving marketing tactic, whereas digital was bottom of the funnel, performance, purchase marketing tactic. And the reason this was so is because only with digital could you validate and prove that an actual path to purchase or a conversion had occurred. Television was always kind of like a black box, but with connected television specifically, this became a non-issue. Now we can validate the impact of media and advertising through the entire marketing funnel. And this helps us ultimately ensure at Samba that all of our clients are making the most out of their media and ad spends. And Connected TV ultimately solved two primary challenges with the data associated with the televisions. The two challenges are frequency capping and incremental reach. Let's start with the first. So we recently published a Q4 State of the Viewership report for our UK and Germany markets. And this report has all sorts of insights about viewership and content consumption, advertisement consumption. And one statistic that really stood out to me was something like 94% of all linear television advertising reached the same 54% of viewers. Let that sink in. What this ultimately tells us is that not only did marketers reach half of their intended audience, but they also reached them twice over, right? So this has serious implications. One, it hints to us that there's wasted advertising spend when you're only reaching half of your designated market, but also brand damage because you're oversaturating the audience more than you intended to. And on a personal note, I think we've all been in that position where we've seen the same ad over and over. Maybe we've even purchased the product and we continue seeing the ad and we just wonder, gosh, like, haven't they figured this out in our industry? This is something that Samba's always actively working on to help resolve for our clients. So ultimately, frequency capping allows us to limit the number of times a consumer is served a particular ad on television. So this should ultimately solve the problem. Now, this brings up the sister challenge to frequency capping, which is incremental reach. It's no secret now that all of us have all sorts of devices that we engage with media and advertising on. So when we interact on these different devices, marketers should really be thinking about a consumer in context of every single device, not just the disparate devices associated to them. And we really have an opportunity for the first time to utilize all of the touch points associated with the different devices in a profound way. So essentially, by capitalizing on incremental reach, what we are doing is we're reaching a consumer on a net new incremental device associated to them, and we're delivering a message throughout the different points on their journey. And this is important because it helps us make sure we're not oversaturating somebody on the same device. We're engaging with them on different devices. So now the golden question is, these are important industry challenges. How do we solve for them? What technology is available for us? And that's where I come in, right? Identity. So identity graphs are the technology that facilitates a resolution to the two challenges that I raised, frequency capping and incremental reach. An identity resolution technology, or an identity graph, resolves disparate signals, so think your laptop, television, phone, tablet, gaming console, all to a persistent individual and or household ID. And this is done in a completely privacy compliant way because it's not actually necessary to know who the consumer is. In the case of Samba, our graphing technology has a probabilistic algorithm that resolves with a 97% accuracy the likelihood that a given set of devices is associated to the same persistent and anonymous individual or household identifier. This is how we are able to figure out when an anonymous user has been reached many times on the same device or a couple of times on different devices, for example. We are able to also facilitate matches in a clean room environment against various data sets. For example, we have clients that have attribute data or external partners, and they want to blend all of that together. We are able to do that for them with the graph as well. And the outcome is the real-time ability to adjust advertising spend and media spend and drive better value for each of the dollar or the euro that you're spending on media and advertisement. And the best part is this whole technology is built on your first-party data. And I will caveat that with connected TV in particular, this industry is somewhat nascent compared to digital and traditional television. So what constitutes as sensitive data in this space is still being determined by legislators, companies, and individuals all over the world. There are hundreds of people working on this issue. And I'm sure that our next speaker, Leslie, will actually address this in greater detail. I am really excited to hear what she has to say on this matter. What I want to underscore about identity resolution, however, is the following. Identity resolution technologies work completely on your first-party data. The graph is anchored and rooted on your first-party data. So as you think about the longevity of your targeting and measurement businesses, the sure way to move forward will always be the ability to reconcile your first-party data to a persistent view of the consumer. And it will continue to be greatly important for your marketing. We feel this way at Samba, and that's exactly why we have this offering on the market, for example. And now that we've discussed all of this, in closing, I'd just like to say that all of us here get to work in a pretty exciting industry. With the new technological developments that we have in marketing, we hold the unique opportunity to delight our consumers with next level content and advertisement, but to do so while we uphold their dignity. And that's a pretty powerful thing. Samba's really excited for all of the new industry developments, on the frontier. We are excited for our partnership with HBB TV. I am so grateful to be here today. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and I warmly welcome any questions.
Thank you very much, Margarita. Very interesting also to see how you solve problems that we have all probably encountered in the past. When you, let's say, interested in buying a refrigerator, you're looking for it, so the ads display special offers, discounts, the latest new models, then you go out and buy one, and the last thing you want to see is ads for refrigerators. So
exactly.
You have just shown us how you tackle this issue. And once again, a reminder for everyone, if you have questions to all of our speakers, please submit them to us and we'll take a look at them at the end of the session. Next, joining us is Leslie from Discovery, also working at the HBB TV Privacy Task Force. And let's go over to Leslie now and see what you have to say. And I'd like to welcome you. Thank you, it's working. And not without saying that it seems to be the usual thing. At the end of the game, the lawyers jump in. Welcome.
Exactly right. Thank you very much. Very happy to be here.
We can see your presentation. Yeah, and it's in presentation mode. Brilliant.
Fantastic. All right, great. Hey, everyone. Very nice to be here. As Jorn introduced me, I am Leslie Shanklin. I manage the Global Privacy Office for Discovery, and I am also currently serving in the role as the co-chair for the HBB TV Privacy Task Force. So I am going to bring us home in this conversation by talking about the legal aspects of programmatic advertising in HBB TV, which is an interesting and continually evolving complex area. So let's just jump in. As Augustine went over, and the audience is probably most generally familiar with, the programmatic advertising ecosystem is a fairly complex one, particularly from a data standpoint. And it is one that frankly has vexed regulators considerably because of its complexity and because a lot of the laws that exist don't really work very well in this kind of very complex ecosystem where data is being exchanged between countless parties in a way that is difficult to manage and oversee and regulate. So as Augustine went over, the essential ecosystem is driven by a real-time bidding process for programmatic, where a bid request will go out from usually from a publisher's SSP. That bid request will always contain some amount of personal data of the user who has hit your website or your app. And that could be a minimal amount of personal data, something just like IP address or device information that would enable the service back of an advertisement. But that real-time bid request, that RTB, could also contain much more extensive personal data about that user. Could be demographic information or other information that pertains to where that user falls in a targeting segment that would be of interest to advertisers. And so there is potentially significant information about that individual user or data subject that is being shared in that moment, the moment that person hits your service in the RTB. And then that data does get sent throughout the programmatic ecosystem. And as Augustine mentioned, and as I think everyone's aware, that is a very large ecosystem, continually growing. This is, probably actually very small snapshot compared to what really exists now, but it is just a visual example of how many players downstream could potentially be accessing the personal data that is shared in that bid request for the purposes of bidding on and ultimately serving the ad to that user. And so that is what really concerns regulators, given the fact that you suddenly are presented with a scenario where countless companies have access to data of a single individual who is now interacting with a single publisher service in that moment, and then multiplying that times all of the interactions that consumers have with websites and apps continually. That is a lot of data sharing that's happening in a way that results in that user's personal data being essentially unmanageably, I think, as regulators would say, sent out into the ecosystem. And then, the various players in that ecosystem then potentially using that data in various ways. And so that is the concern that underlies the continuing focus on programmatic and how it is possible to reconcile this ecosystem with the requirements, the fairly strict restrictive requirements of European data protection law. So let's go back and just set the stage a bit for European data protection law and looking at what those fundamental laws are that drive compliance in this area. So let's just take a quick step back to before GDPR. So before GDPR went into effect in 2018, there was another law on the books in Europe called the EU Privacy Directive that already had existed and governs many things around targeted advertising and also things like email marketing and different ways in which digital services might be engaging with consumers. In 2011, there was an amendment to that privacy directive that's called in shorthand the Cookies Directive, but it is important to understand that it doesn't just deal with cookies. Cookies are one particular type of technology that is used for gathering information from a user in the digital environment and also for serving targeted advertising. That technology could also be something else like a pixel or a web beacon or an SDK. It's all of those kinds of technologies that are at play in this directive, which essentially, when passed, required consent for storing information from or collecting information from a user's device. At the time that that went into effect, it was generally interpreted across Europe to be acceptable from a compliance perspective to approach that requirement as one of implied consent. And that complied consent was complied with by these cookie banners that went up and were in place on European services for many, many years prior to GDPR. Those were the standard old school cookie banners, which essentially said something to the effect of, by continuing to use this service, you are agreeing to the placement of cookies and the collection of data, etc. So that was the state of play for a lot of years before GDPR went into effect. Then in 2018, GDPR was made effective, and at that time, it had been hoped for that an update to the e-privacy directive would also, at the same time, have gone into effect. And that was anticipated to be sort of an upgrade from the e-privacy directive to the e-privacy regulation, which would have made, hopefully, the rules more clear, and particularly would have hopefully provided more clarity as to the interplay between these e-privacy consent requirements and GDPR. Unfortunately, the e-privacy regulation never got finalized and actually is still underway at the moment. So we still don't have that final clarity. And these kind of consent issues that exist in the ad tech space, and particularly in the programmatic space, really are some of the most vexing questions that are continuing to require debate and discussion and ultimately, I think, have delayed the finalization of the e-privacy regulation. So what that meant is that when the GDPR went into effect in 2018, it was very unclear for the industry how the GDPR rules for getting consent impacted the e-privacy directive rules on cookies and trackers. And so for a period after GDPR, market practice continued to be somewhat unchanged with these implied consent banners until I would say fairly well into 2019. And in 2019, a variety of EU data protection authorities did pass some guidance or issue some guidance around these issues, most notably, I think initially the ICO, the UK regulator, and the CNIL, the French regulator, issued some guidance that made much more clear what they expected in terms of that interplay. And there was also a really important court decision that was issued that also provided much more clarity. And the combination of that evolving guidance and the court decisions that have continued to evolve have made clear that that implied consent cookie banner approach was not acceptable. That GDPR required that wherever the law requires consent for something, that consent has to be obtained in a way that is adequate under GDPR. And under GDPR, to get sufficient consent, that consent has to meet a variety of criteria. Most importantly, that it be express and opt-in. It cannot be implied. The user has to take a very affirmative action to give that consent. And so that meant that those implied consent cookie banners were not going to work any longer. And also it was clear that that consent was going to be required for non-essential tracking technologies. And I'll talk in another slide a little bit more about what that means in terms of essential versus non-essential. But again, as I said, also clear that that consent requirement applied not just to cookies, but to any kind of tracking technologies that might be used to gather information from a user, or potentially to set a technology to store information on a user's device, which is what's happening when you place a cookie. So just again, really quickly to compare the e-privacy directive versus GDPR, because I do think that there's often some confusion about this, and there's, I think, a high degree of awareness about GDPR, but there often isn't quite as much awareness about the e-privacy directive. But really, it's the e-privacy directive, a completely separate law that drives the consent requirements for tracking and the kinds of tracking and targeting that takes place using personal data in the programmatic ecosystem. So just very quickly, as I said, the e-privacy directive, which I note is a directive, which means it is not binding law immediately in Europe. What has to happen is each EU member state then has to implement that directive in local legislation. And in doing so, often those local laws interpret the requirements of the directive in some varying ways, and then guidance that might be issued further for that local legislation might further interpret that requirement even with more variation. And so what you end up with the directive, when you, as opposed to a regulation, is you often end up with very disparate interpretations of that at the local level. And so you end up with multiple different requirements across Europe, and publishers who are trying to comply with these requirements often having to figure out how to reconcile what appears to be very different interpretations of the rules across Europe. I will note that GDPR is a regulation, and the whole idea of GDPR was to try to reconcile and harmonize laws across Europe. I will say in practice, it has ended up with quite a lot of variation in local interpretation as well. And so all of that local variation continues to create a lot of complexity for compliance, particularly in the ad tech space for all of the players in that space. So again, going back to e-privacy directive, the requirements fundamentally are consent is needed for any storage of information on or collection of information from a user device. It is useful to note that actually those requirements apply whether or not it's personal data. applies regardless of the legal status of the company as being a data controller or processor. And there are some exceptions that do apply, and those exceptions are what now publishers essentially rely upon when they present their consent management tools, and where the publishers don't, for example, seek consent for essential data gathering if the user has specifically requested the service, and that creates some complexity, that particular exception. So the most fundamental exception that's relied upon for, I would say, for CTV, and there is complexity for HBBTV around this, which I'll go into just a bit, but frankly, those issues are being looked at very closely right now by the Privacy Task Force, the HBBTV Privacy Task Force. That the exception that does apply most directly is you do not need consent if you are storing the information or collecting the information in a way that is essential for the technical delivery of a service that the user has specifically requested. And so with regard to something like a website or an app, that's a bit easier because the user will have specifically opened the app or specifically have landed on the URL and tried to enact with a website. And so that last element that's in italics of user has specifically requested is met. And so then the publisher just needs to figure out whether or not the data collection or storage is essential for the technical delivery of the service. If so, no consent is needed. There is, as I said, some more complexity in HBBTV, which I'll mention in a moment. But then, pivoting to GDPR, there are, differences. GDPR is a comprehensive piece of data protection legislation that requires a lot of different compliance elements for a fundamental privacy program. All of these requirements around consent are just one element of GDPR requirements. GDPR requires all sorts of things in terms of data inventories called Article 30 records, data protection impact assessments, legitimate interest assessments, provisions in contracts with vendors. There's a whole suite of requirements of GDPR. So all these consent requirements are just one element of GDPR. GDPR applies specifically to personal data. There are a lot of conversations around what is personal data and what is not. For this issue with programmatic and the programmatic ecosystem, I will say that there is a lot that is being shared in the ecosystem that is definitely personal data, and that includes any kind of online identifiers from IP address to device ID to any other kind of unique identifiers, and then of course any sort of user attributes that might be shared in a bid request that, for example, the user falls into a demographic age category of 24 to 55, that the user is considered high income, that the user is an auto intender who is known to be looking for a car. All of those sorts of things are personal data, so certainly governed by GDPR. Generally, under GDPR, data controllers bear the primary responsibility. And in this scenario with HBBTV and programmatic advertising, generally speaking, it is the publisher of the HBBTV app that would be considered the data controller and therefore bear primary responsibility legally under GDPR. And so, as I said earlier, it is GDPR that actually imposes the strict legal requirements for consent, but the consent requirements themselves are driven by the e-privacy directive. And so just very quickly, in terms of what is required in terms of consent for data, these data exchanges that are made in programmatic, as I said, consent would be required for anything that is not strictly necessary or essential for the technical operation of the service. And so if you look at something like HBBTV and an HBBTV app, you could potentially say that what would be essential for the delivery of that app would be technology, any kind of data collection that is essential to actually provide the app itself and the essential features of the app. But it would not apply to any data collection or data sharing associated with advertising, because advertising would not be considered essential to the technical delivery of the HBBTV service. I will also note very quickly that there is a lot of variation in the law in Europe around first-party analytics and collection of data for that. EU regulators are somewhat split on this. I'm not going to go into that in a lot of detail because really here with programmatic advertising, we're talking about an area where it's clear that consent is needed. And so as Augustine went through, the principal means by which publishers get consent now under what is now a very clear directive to get consent for any data collection or processing for advertising purposes in Europe. That consent is gathered through a consent management tool, a consent management platform tool that are generally called CMPs. And those CMPs typically have two components. I think everyone in Europe is very used to seeing these. They are pop-ups that appear on your screen as soon as you land on a website or open an app. And they have an initial pop-up where you can accept the tracking. I will say just very briefly, the regulators in Europe, particularly in certain jurisdictions, are increasingly pushing to have also a reject button on this first banner. So you're starting to see publishers pivot towards adding reject button so that the acceptance and the rejection of trackers is easily done, one versus the other. Then these CMP tools always have a preference center, which is a second layer where the user can go in and make much more granular choices about the tracking that they're happy with and what they're not. Usually these are broken down into categories. You can see this is an example here from a discovery property where it's always clear that essential trackers are on. Always there's no choice given around them for the reasons I mentioned, that they don't need consent. There's sometimes variability as to how first-party analytics is dealt with, but advertising or marketing always will require consent in these tools, so that toggle to choose that will always be defaulted off. And then baked into these CMPs now, particularly for companies that are engaging in programmatic advertising, are the IAB consent framework purposes. So you can see those here, and I'll just to mention then, what is the IAB TCF? Augustine went through this a little bit. This is very, very important for programmatic. So IAB TCF is a framework that is developed by the Internet Advertising Bureau in Europe for the purposes of creating an industry self-regulatory framework, particularly for programmatic, for compliance with these requirements. The chief challenge being that all of these companies that are downstream in the programmatic ecosystem aren't in a position to directly gather consent from the user. And the only party that's really in the position to do that is the publisher of that service. And so it is the publisher that through this framework is in the position of gathering the consent, using the IAB framework, which sets forth a lot of different purposes for which all of these downstream players can use the data. And that publisher gets that consent through their CMP tool and then sends those consent strings down to all of the members of the IAB framework who receive those consents and then are required under the terms of the TCF to honor those choices that are made by that user. One thing I'll say very briefly, and I know we're getting short on time, is that you'll hear that there's some challenges that have been raised to the validity of the IAB framework. The Belgian DPA has recently issued a decision raising some challenges to that framework. I will say that some of the articles around this decision are a bit overblown, suggesting that the entire framework is being called into question. That is not the case. There are some very specific aspects of the framework and the way in which the IAB is itself processing data through these consent strings that was found to be not compliant with GDPR. It is subject to appeal. The IAB does plan to appeal. And so you might read a lot that suggests that the whole framework is being found to be invalid and thrown out the door. That is not accurate. And so right now, I think the industry is in the position of a wait and see mode to see what happens with this framework, whether or not it needs to be updated in some way, but it is not as if it is currently being held to be completely invalid. And then just very quickly to finish up. So generally speaking, I would say that the use of CMPs in the CTV environment generally, and then even further in HbbTV, is not yet widespread. That is for a variety of reasons. The off-the-shelf CMP products hadn't really been widely available. until fairly recently for CTV, there's a much more challenging user experience with having to use a remote as opposed to interacting with your phone keyboard or your PC or your computer keyboard. And so there's concerns about that. And then also just users aren't as used to seeing it. So for a variety of reasons, I would say the market is continuing to move forward and is not yet there with regard to fully implementing CMPs and CTV, and even further for HbbTV. Those tools are becoming available. Augustine talked about the tools that are being made available by his company. I'd say that those will continuing to be more widely available. In the meantime, and while there haven't been as many tools available off the shelf in the market, publishers who are providing HbbTV services have, in many cases, developed their own HbbTV sort of homegrown CMP solutions. This is just an example of one from RTL that is in place on HbbTV for them in Europe. I'm sorry, in Germany. So that's something we'll continue to see evolve. So I think that's where we are. And just to sum up, I would say that, you know, this is an evolving area. The law is moving very fast. All of the requirements are varied, and I would say that the bottom line is that I think what we're moving to is implementation of something akin to a CMP tool in HbbTV. That how that works and how the user interacts with that is still something that's continuing to evolve. But I think regulators will expect to see this particularly for compliance with programmatic advertising in the HbbTV environment.
Thank you very much, Leslie. An interesting and obviously evolving topic, as we've seen. And so we know now all about the legal aspects of programmatic advertising and, of course, the GDPR issue. I'd like to move on very briefly to the Q&A. We've received a couple of questions that you can see here. I'd like to start with Margarita. So please, all the speakers, can you switch on your webcams so we all have you on board again for the last couple of minutes. Margarita, let me see. You are on audio, we can't see you yet. No, you're on video, we can't hear you yet. Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Brilliant. Just two questions for you. TV may not be a personal device. How do you think to identify? Identity on this kind of shared device?
So this is a great question, and one that we wrestle with in every single market. TV is a household level device, right? So we can view television at a household level identifier, but how we try to glean at whether it's a single person household or whether there are multiple individuals in a household is we probably need some kind of different touch points, such as a mobile device or a tablet that appears on that same IP address. And most always, that's how we're able to reconcile that the individual is associated with the household or that the household has multiple individuals. I hope that answers your question. It's a great question, and if anything, reach out to me. I'll be happy to continue the conversation.
Okay, so it's the multiple device angle that you're taking here. The last question for you, Margarita: does Samba TV provide socio-demographic data about the TV viewer?
Yes, in some cases we do. It depends on what it is that you need and for what use cases. But let's chat. I'd be happy to walk through this with you and hopefully help.
Okay, thank you very much, Margarita. I know you have to leave sharp at the hour, so thanks again for your great presentation and the insights about Samba TV. I'm sure we'll hear again from you. All the best and take care. Now, for the rest of you, Augustine, let's start with you first. A question directed at you. Can you adapt the user interface to the channel design?
Well, this is a good question. Of course, we can make some changes, but so, for example, in this case, we have adapted the size of the banner. We include some links, for example, to the privacy policy that were not before. But at the end, there is something important that you have to know is that we have to comply with the information that the TCF, Transparency and Consent Framework, oblige us to put in that banner. So especially because it's a common question, we cannot change easily. We cannot change the text of the banner because it's measured word by word to give a standardized message that complies with GDPR. So yes, we can adapt the interface. We have to see in each case the changes. We have some possibilities in terms of design, change background, color, change fonts, etc. And that's it.
So there are a couple of options. One further question for you, Augustine. What is blacklisted devices? Does it mean vulnerable implementation?
No. It means that you know, the range of manufacturers, of TV manufacturers, is very wide. So you can find manufacturers from all countries and with many different operating systems, and it happens and from with that starting that you can buy, you bought this year, but maybe that you bought 10 years ago, and in some cases the CMP has limitations, and therefore we have to limit. We did some testing in a huge range of devices, and we have to discard a small percentage of the devices to show the CMP. So that means that you don't gather the consent in those devices, and therefore you shouldn't go for analytics, for advertising and all these things into those devices. That generally those devices are the ones that in general terms will be more difficult, that also support this new way of advertising. But this is something that as the devices are evolving, and some of them are renewed by the users, so this problem will end up with the time.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look into the future. Now, Leslie, the last question is for you. How big impact was brought to the ad industry by GDPR and e-privacy in Europe? What was the impact?
I would say it's fairly massive and continuing to be so. The way that the ad industry has evolved really relies on personal data sharing at its core, and that is particularly the case with programmatic in terms of the open bidding type of programmatic, where without this data sharing, without users consenting to that programmatic really doesn't work. And we're continuing to see increasing pressure coming from regulators to pivot the way that consents are gathered, to do things like add a reject all button, for example, which will continue to mean that the kinds of user data that the industry essentially relies upon as its essential means of engaging in this ecosystem really is becoming harder and harder. And you're seeing a lot of shift also in terms of the big players in the tech side trying to do things to stay ahead of the increasing pressure and regulation. So you're seeing, Google start to talk about things like moving away from, cookies and what are all alternatives for that, to try to find a way to continue to allow targeted advertising to happen in Europe, even with the increasingly strict requirements in place. And I think it's anyone's guess ultimately how those two competing driving forces are going to be reconciled, but it is definitely creating a lot of forced change in the ecosystem.
Thank you, Leslie. As you can see from all the presentations and the Q&A part, it's a complex issue and an issue that keeps developing and reshaping itself and changing the standards of the industry, and of course the impact on you and your company if you want to be involved in this industry. I would say the best thing to do for you if you want to be involved with these matters is to join the HBB-TV Association as a member and be active as part of the task forces and working groups, because that's the way you can shape all these things from inside the industry and the market players. and of course through the webinar series, in which we keep updating you on new topics that are relevant to the industry and its players. The next webinar is in mid-March. We're currently discussing a couple of options, and you'll of course be informed about the topic and date and time. And the big news is, you might have seen it already on a press release and in social media, the 10th HBBTV Symposium and Awards is taking place this year in Prague on November the 9th and 10th in collaboration with AKTV, the Association of Commercial Television over in the Czech Republic. So we're really looking forward to this big event, our main event of the HBBTV and Connected TV community each year. So this year you've got now the date, the city, and the co-host. And of course, we invite you to send us your suggestions for further webinar topics to webinar@hbbtv.org, and of course follow the HBBTV Association for all the latest updates on Twitter and on LinkedIn. As I said at the beginning, this webinar is recorded, and you can take a look at the recording on the HBBTV Association's website on YouTube, and also on the HBBTV website there'll be the presentations available for you to download as PDF files. Thank you very much to the speakers, and thank you very much to watching this live session. We're looking forward to seeing you again in a month from now. Thank you, take care, and bye-bye.